Welcome to Ancient Forbidden Knowledge. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode, we unlock a chapter of history hidden in shadows and buried beneath centuries of silence. Long before the rise of Christianity as we know it, a secretive group known as the Essenes guarded teachings that challenged both the Roman Empire and the Church itself. Who were they, and what truths did they protect so fiercely that even the Vatican feared their survival? From healing practices and prophecy to direct encounters with divine intelligence, the Essenes may have preserved a knowledge so powerful it threatened the foundations of religion and history alike. Why were their teachings erased, and what ancient power did they carry that could still shake the world today? The story begins in a turbulent age, ancient Judea, during the final centuries before the Common Era. Rome's expanding grip tightened around the region, bringing with it legions, taxes, and the weight of empire. But beneath the surface, something older stirred. Along the shores of the Dead Sea, in the shadows of desert cliffs and limestone caves, a secluded brotherhood lived apart from the world. They were called the Essenes. They wore white robes, practiced strict discipline, and rejected the corruption of both Roman rule and the priesthood in Jerusalem. They spoke of light and darkness, of cosmic order and divine knowledge. But most importantly, they believed themselves to be the guardians of a sacred truth the world was not ready to hear. Unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, the more public religious factions of the time, the Essenes did not seek converts. They did not stand in temples or lecture in the marketplaces. Their world was one of quiet devotion, ritual purity, and spiritual preparation. They lived communally, held their possessions in common, and spent hours in meditation, prayer, and study. According to accounts from writers like Pliny the Elder and Philo of Alexandria, they abstained from sensual pleasures and believed deeply in the immortality of the soul. But beyond these surface practices lay something far more radical, something that made their continued existence dangerous. The Essenes possessed scrolls, now known to history as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contained teachings that diverged sharply from accepted religious doctrine. They spoke of hidden wisdom passed down from ancient times. They recorded visions of heavenly beings, cosmic battles, and a divine hierarchy unseen by ordinary eyes. More than that, they held knowledge of healing, methods of using herbs, oils, sound, and intention to restore the body and spirit. In an era dominated by imperial control and religious dogma, these ideas were more than heretical. They were revolutionary. Among the Essenes, prophecy was not metaphor, it was practice. They believed in direct communication with celestial forces. They spoke of a coming teacher, a messianic figure who would bring light to a darkened world. But unlike the apocalyptic fury of later Christian teachings, the Essenes emphasized inner transformation. They believed that enlightenment began within, that by purifying the body, stilling the mind, and aligning with divine law, one could become a vessel for higher truth. Yet these beliefs could not remain hidden forever. The growing tension between Rome, the Jewish people, and fringe sects like the Essenes would erupt into conflict. The temple in Jerusalem would fall. The scrolls would vanish into caves. And the quiet brotherhood, once a flickering light in the desert, would disappear from history, or so it seemed. But fragments remained. And those fragments told of a wisdom older than any empire, a truth that had to be buried to protect the powers that be. In the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon a cave near Qumran, just west of the Dead Sea. Inside, hidden within broken jars, he found scrolls, ancient and fragile, their Hebrew letters etched in fading ink. What he discovered would soon be recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. These were the lost writings of the Essenes. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Dozens of manuscripts followed, uncovered from 11 separate caves over the next decade. They contained texts that predated any known versions of the Hebrew Bible, but they also included something else: hymns, apocalyptic visions, and rule books from a community that did not fit into any official religious narrative. These were voices from a vanished sect, a brotherhood that had been erased from history. The scrolls spoke of a teacher of righteousness, a mysterious, unnamed figure who had been persecuted by a corrupt establishment. They described a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, framed not merely as symbolic forces, but as literal, organized groups on earth. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. A war of ideologies, of spiritual truth against institutional deception. But perhaps most disturbing to scholars and theologians was the resemblance between these teachings and the early doctrines of Christianity. The scrolls revealed a messianic vision, but not the one canonized in church doctrine. Their Messiah was not a suffering saviour, but a bringer of divine knowledge. He was not alone either. The text hinted at two messianic figures, one priestly, one kingly, a dual Messiah tradition, a balance of spiritual authority and earthly leadership. This concept directly challenged the singular Messiah figure in Christian orthodoxy, and more than that, it implied that the early followers of this tradition were not Christians at all, but Essenes, or those shaped by Essene thought long before the Church constructed its narrative. The implications were immediate and dangerous. If the teachings of Jesus were influenced by Essene doctrine, then the foundation of Christian theology rested on suppressed sectarian thought. Worse, if the Essenes had preserved ancient knowledge passed down from even earlier civilizations, then both biblical and secular timelines were flawed. The Church could not accept this, nor could political authorities whose power depended on the existing historical order. Efforts to contain and control the narrative began swiftly. The Vatican requested access to the scrolls. For decades, many of the manuscripts were kept hidden from the public and from most scholars. Only a small group of church-affiliated academics were allowed to study and publish them. What were they afraid of? The answer may lie not only in what the scrolls revealed, but in what they suggested had been deliberately concealed. Healing techniques not found in Scripture, references to celestial beings not aligned with Judeo-Christian angels, a structured spiritual practice centered on vibration, purity, and consciousness. These were not the teachings of an isolated desert sect. They echoed something far older, something global, perhaps even pre-human. And for those in power, that possibility was intolerable. The scrolls were not just archaeological relics, they were threats to the entire architecture of belief. Hidden within the fragmented parchments were subtle, recurring patterns, clues that pointed far beyond the arid hills of Qumran. Certain symbols and phrases appeared repeatedly: the tree of life, the divine feminine, the language of light, and sacred geometry woven into the structure of ritual and scripture. These references did not belong solely to Jewish mysticism or early Christian ideology. They echoed teachings found in ancient Egypt, in Sumer, in the Vedas of India. The Essenes were not inventing a new religion. They were preserving something far older, a root system of sacred knowledge that had travelled across time and culture, passed down in secrecy while empires rose and fell. Some scrolls contained prayers and meditations that aligned with what modern science now recognizes as sound therapy and vibrational healing. They described the use of specific tones, vocal harmonics, and resonance for spiritual purification. Others referenced the alignment of stars, the movement of heavenly bodies, and their influence on the human spirit. This was not primitive superstition. It was a highly developed system of cosmological understanding. One scroll described a form of inner initiation, achieved through solitude, fasting, and attunement to celestial rhythms. Another warned of the dangers of spiritual ignorance, not as sin, but as disconnection from the universal law that binds all life. But these were not the only writings that survived. Outside the official Dead Sea Scrolls collection, whispers of Essene doctrine lived on in obscure manuscripts scattered throughout Europe and the Near East. In a 15th century document stored in a remote monastery, a reference appeared to an ancient healing art said to come from a desert sect devoted to the light of the first sun. In another, housed in the library of a private collection in southern France, there were coded diagrams resembling both the Kabbalistic tree of life and early alchemical symbols. All of these clues point to a tradition that cannot be confined within a single culture or century. The Essenes seem to have inherited a lineage of wisdom that stretched backward beyond recorded history, perhaps to the survivors of some forgotten cataclysm, or to travellers from realms unacknowledged by modern science. Their writings do not plead for belief. They assume knowledge, They instruct, reveal, and illuminate. And their silence in mainstream history is not an accident. It is an erasure. If these scrolls had been released without restriction, if scholars had been free to interpret them without interference, the entire shape of biblical history, and perhaps human history, might look different today. But instead, the scrolls were fragmented, translated selectively, and surrounded by decades of secrecy. The dominant narrative was protected, and the patterns pointing to something greater were ignored or dismissed as coincidence. Yet coincidence does not explain the convergence of these teachings with symbols found in distant temples, oral traditions, and mystery schools around the world. Coincidence does not explain how a sect in the Judean desert could articulate ideas about consciousness and the cosmos that mirror teachings in ancient Tibet or pre-dynastic Egypt. The cracks in the official story are not small. They are wide enough to walk through. And on the other side waits a version of history that most are still not ready to face. The deeper one looks into the Essene tradition, the more unmistakable the parallels become. Their rituals of purification with water echo the practices of Hindu ascetics along the banks of the Ganges. Their reverence for light as both symbol and force mirrors the Zoroastrian worship of Ahura Mazda, the radiant source of all wisdom. Their belief in the divine duality, male and female aspects of creation in balance, is found not only in Egyptian temples but carved into stones on distant continents, where similar ideograms tell stories of balance, unity, and rebirth. These are not the echoes of a fringe cult. They are the remnants of a global language of consciousness, one that predates the written word. Throughout Mesoamerica, depictions of white-robed figures appear in murals and codices, figures who arrive from the east, bearing sacred knowledge, only to vanish into legend. In the Andes, stories persist of healers and prophets who taught the people about the stars, vibration, and harmony with the earth. Indigenous shamans in Siberia speak of beings of light who descend in times of spiritual crisis to awaken memory. All of these cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, describe initiates who possess knowledge strikingly similar to what the Essenes wrote in their scrolls. One recurring symbol stands out, the tree. The Essenes described it not as a mere metaphor, but as a living diagram of the soul's journey. With roots in the earth and branches reaching into the heavens, the tree of life represented the full spectrum of creation. This exact structure appears in Kabbalah, in Norse mythology as Yggdrasil, in ancient Mesopotamian tablets, and in the sacred carvings of pre-Columbian temples. The symbol speaks of realms, of pathways between dimensions, of the soul's ability to rise through initiation and understanding. That such a symbol recurs globally cannot be coincidence. It suggests a shared ancestry of knowledge, a forgotten transmission. Another striking pattern is the use of sacred sound. The Essenes used tonal chanting to harmonize their bodies and minds with natural frequencies. In Egypt, priests chanted to activate temples. In Tibet, monks use harmonic overtones to reach altered states. Aboriginal Australians speak of song lines, vibrational maps that shape the land itself. All of these systems rely on resonance, frequency, and intention. They are technologies of consciousness. And they point to a time when humanity was attuned to forces no longer recognized by modern science. Even the Essene diet was intentional. They practiced plant-based fasting regimens, not for health alone, but to increase sensitivity to unseen energies. They consumed herbs known for their psychoactive and purifying properties. In their texts, specific plants are mentioned for clearing the mind, opening the heart, and preparing the body to receive divine impressions. Similar plant rituals are found in the Amazon basin, in Native American lodges, and in the lost rites of the Eleusinian mysteries. Again, the pattern emerges, a unified system of human transformation, scattered like broken glass across the ages. The Essenes did not invent these practices. They inherited them, they refined them, and for a time they protected them. But they were not alone in this mission. All over the world, fragments of the same knowledge surface, pointing not to isolated development, but to a shared source, long forgotten and possibly intentionally erased. It is not the rituals themselves that threaten the official story. It is what they reveal about who we were and what we might still be. As the scrolls began to circulate among scholars in the mid-20th century, The potential implications became clear. But instead of celebration, there was hesitation. The academic establishment, tightly bound to institutional religion and state-backed archaeology, responded not with curiosity, but with containment. Committees were formed, access was restricted, translation was delayed. For nearly 40 years, a small circle of researchers controlled the scrolls. Most were affiliated with theological institutions or directly tied to the Catholic Church. Independent scholars were denied entry. The reason offered was caution. The real reason may have been control. Universities, funded by religious endowments or national governments, were not eager to revise their foundations. Entire careers had been built upon linear timelines, upon the assumption that monotheism emerged gradually and that Jesus was a rupture in history. But the Essenes scrolls told another story, one of continuity, of evolution, of a tradition that stretched back into the mists of time, a tradition that did not begin with the Church, but long before it. To accept the scrolls at face value would mean admitting that sacred knowledge existed outside the canon, that direct contact with the divine was not mediated by clergy, and that ancient humanity possessed wisdom equal to or greater than our own. So the firewall rose. Public commentary was cautious. Theories that connected Essene teachings to early Christianity were dismissed as fringe. Connections between the scrolls and other esoteric traditions were labelled pseudoscience, and the suggestion that the Essenes were the inheritors of a pre-biblical wisdom tradition was ridiculed or ignored. The gatekeepers held firm, but outside the academy the information began to seep out. Researchers working independently uncovered parallels between the Essene texts and long-forgotten Gnostic writings. In the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, banned from the biblical canon, similar phrases and teachings appeared. The kingdom of heaven is within. The body is a vessel for light. Divine knowledge is accessed through silence and purity. These were not metaphors, they were instructions. And the more they were compared, the more it became clear that the early followers of the Essene path were practitioners, not merely believers. But the academic firewall persisted. Critics claimed that the connections were coincidental, that the Essenes were a minor sect with no lasting influence, that the scrolls were too fragmented to draw conclusions. Yet when asked why so many of those fragments remained hidden, why access was still limited decades after their discovery, answers became vague. Security, preservation, politics. In truth, it appeared that the firewall was not built to protect the scrolls from damage. It was built to protect belief from disruption. Even today, the scrolls remain only partially translated and published. Outside the walls of academia and dogma, new theories began to take shape, unorthodox but compelling. If the Essenes were not simply a fringe Jewish sect, but inheritors of an ancient spiritual science, then who were their teachers? Some researchers proposed that the Essenes had access to a pre-flood legacy of knowledge, passed down through oral traditions that survived the cataclysm spoken of in nearly every ancient culture. Others suggested that they were not preserving local doctrine, but fragments of a forgotten global system, one designed not to convert, but to awaken. Among these fringe theories, one stands out for its breadth and implications, that the Essenes were part of a long lineage of initiates, guardians of cosmic knowledge once entrusted to humanity by non-human intelligences. These intelligences, described in ancient texts as shining beings, watchers, or star people, appear again and again in Essene writings as sons of light. To mainstream scholars, these are metaphors for goodness or moral purity, but to others they are literal references to extraterrestrial or interdimensional contact. The Essenes may have believed they were not only studying divine law, they were receiving it. This theory is strengthened by strange consistencies in Essene practices, their obsession with the stars, their precise tracking of lunar and solar cycles, their understanding of vibrational healing and consciousness states. These are not hallmarks of isolated mystics, they are hallmarks of a structured, transmitted science. In the Book of Enoch, a text revered by the Essenes but later excluded from Christian canon, there is a vivid account of beings from the heavens descending to earth, imparting knowledge of metallurgy, medicine, astronomy, and language. The parallels are difficult to ignore. And if these stories are more than myth, then the Essenes were not inventing religion. They were preserving a memory of contact. Another theory draws on the concept of dimensional resonance. According to this idea, the Essenes practiced techniques to alter their consciousness and interface with higher realms of existence, realms described in mystical terms as the heavens, or the world of light. Through meditation, diet, sound, and purification, they opened themselves to direct communication with intelligences that existed beyond ordinary perception. This was not worship in the traditional sense, it was communion. In this view, sacred teachings were not commandments, but frequencies. The scrolls were not simply scripture, but encoded keys designed to activate memory, raise awareness, and recalibrate the human vessel. The rituals of the Essenes were not symbolic, they were functional. Steps in a process of transformation that linked the human being to a greater cosmic intelligence. These ideas are dismissed by the orthodox, not because they lack coherence, but because they lead to conclusions that challenge every pillar of modern understanding: history, religion, science, and identity. If the Essenes were preserving extraterrestrial knowledge, then history must be rewritten. If they were engaging with higher consciousness, then human potential must be reimagined. And if their teachings were buried on purpose, then those who buried them must be questioned. Because it would mean that the truth was never lost, it was taken. Hidden not by accident, but by design. To understand why such knowledge would be deliberately buried, we must ask the most difficult question of all: who benefits from the lie? The suppression of the Essene teachings did not happen in isolation. It happened alongside a systematic consolidation of spiritual authority, beginning with the Roman Empire's co-opting of Christianity and extending into the birth of organized religion as a tool of power. When Emperor Constantine declared Christianity the state religion in the 4th century, he did not adopt the teachings of the Essenes. He codified doctrine. He selected which texts would survive. He silenced the rest. The Council of Nicaea, convened in the year 325, was not a spiritual gathering. It was a political event. The purpose was not to uncover truth. It was to unify belief, eliminate dissent, and centralize control. Dozens of gospels were excluded. Alternative views of Christ's nature, purpose, and origin were deemed heresy. The mystical, transformative path of the Essenes, one rooted in inner awakening and cosmic communion, was replaced with hierarchical worship, original sin, and obedience to authority. The church that emerged did not want seekers, it wanted followers. The Essenes represented a threat to this structure. They taught that the divine could be accessed directly. That enlightenment was not given, but cultivated. That healing was natural and consciousness eternal. In a world where control depends on fear, ignorance, and division, these were dangerous ideas, ideas that had to be destroyed. And so they were. Scrolls were hidden, Gnostic sects were hunted, oral traditions were extinguished, and what remained was a tightly managed version of spiritual history, sanitized, edited, and weaponized. But it did not stop there. Over the centuries, institutions of power, churches, monarchies, secret orders, and later governments continued the erasure. Knowledge of natural healing was outlawed or discredited. The study of consciousness was dismissed as pseudoscience. Those who questioned the official timeline of history were ridiculed or silenced. And, always at the center of this suppression was the same underlying fear that humanity might remember what it once knew. To erase the Essenes was to erase a key link in the chain, a bridge between the wisdom of ancient civilizations and the fractured world of today. Their teachings reveal a spiritual technology that connects biology, cosmology, and consciousness, a system that empowers the individual rather than enslaving the masses. Those who guard the official narrative cannot allow that. Because it would mean the institutions that claim to guide humanity have instead misled it, intentionally, repeatedly, and without accountability. The question is not whether the Essene knowledge was hidden. That much is certain. The question is who decided it had to be hidden and why. The answer leads to the very foundations of our modern world, to the intersection of religion, empire, and control, to a design centuries in the making that keeps the mind confined, the spirit dulled, and the past forgotten. Not because the truth is lost, but because those in power fear what would happen if we found it. If the teachings of the Essenes are true, If they really did preserve a system of wisdom that connects humanity to something far older, far greater, then everything we understand about ourselves must change. Our history, our religions, our sciences, even our understanding of what it means to be human, all would need to be re-examined. The Essenes did not speak of salvation through belief. They spoke of transformation through knowledge. Their rituals were not acts of worship, but processes of activation. The soul, they taught, is not judged after death. It is evolving through life, through consciousness, through choice. In the scrolls, the physical body was seen as a vessel of light. Disease was described not as punishment, but as imbalance. Healing was achieved not through external authority, but through realignment with universal law. This concept of energetic harmony, of self-healing, of internal mastery, challenges modern medicine, psychology, and theology all at once. It suggests that the human being is not a passive creature in need of saving, but a dynamic intelligence capable of communion with higher realms. That the divine spark lies not in a distant heaven, but within the self. This is not a message of rebellion. It is a message of responsibility. If the soul is sovereign, then so is the mind, so is the body, and in that sovereignty lies a power that cannot be taxed, governed, or mediated by religious intermediaries. That is what makes it dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is free. And freedom, true spiritual freedom, has always been the enemy of empires. If the Essenes were right, then the structures that define our world, governments, religions, media, even education, are built on sand. They rely not on truth but on consensus, not on wisdom but on control. The sacred texts we are taught to revere may only be fragments. The temples we are told to honor may only be echoes. The science we are told to trust may be blind to forces it refuses to measure. And the potential within each human being may be far more extraordinary than we have been allowed to believe. Imagine a world where Essene knowledge was never buried. A world where children were taught to meditate instead of memorize. Where plants were medicine and sound was therapy. Where the movement of stars guided the soul, not just the calendar. Where initiation replaced indoctrination and inner light was more important than external labels. That world is not fantasy. It is memory, dimmed, distorted, and denied. But memory can be restored, and once remembered, it cannot be unlearned. The question that remains is not whether the Essenes held this knowledge. The question is whether we are willing to reclaim it, to lift the veil, not just on history, but on the self. Because the moment we do, the illusion begins to crack. The false structures begin to tremble, and what lies beneath is not chaos, but clarity. A different kind of power, one not handed down, but awakened, one not enforced, but remembered. And in that remembering, we may finally begin to understand why it was hidden in the first place. The story of the Essenes is not just a mystery buried in the sand or locked behind stone walls. It is a mirror held up to our world today. A forgotten chapter that reflects not only what was lost, but what was taken, deliberately, strategically, and with purpose. Their teachings offer more than spiritual comfort. They offer a framework for rediscovering who and what we truly are. They speak of a humanity that once lived in harmony with the earth, with the stars, and with the unseen forces that shape both. A humanity that understood reality not as a cold material system, but as a living field of energy, consciousness, and sacred design. It is easy to view the Essenes as a footnote in history, a desert sect with strange beliefs. But the scrolls tell a different story. They hint at an ancient continuum, a line of transmission that stretches across continents, cultures, and lifetimes. A knowledge older than temples, older than language. Passed from hand to hand in silence, hidden in symbols, rituals, and myths, waiting for a time when it could be heard again. That time may be now. The veil between the known and the forgotten is thinner than ever. The cracks in the official story have widened. People are asking questions once whispered only in private. Why are so many ancient traditions speaking the same symbolic language? Why were healing, consciousness, and cosmology once part of the same science? Why does every power structure, from empire to institution, fear this convergence? The answer is simple. Because this knowledge liberates, not just from ignorance, but from control. It dissolves the illusion of separation. It awakens the memory of something vast, intelligent, and infinite, not out there, but within. To walk the path of the Essenes is not to follow dogma. It is to remember what was hidden in plain sight, the rhythm of the stars, the vibration of the soul, the sacred geometry of breath and thought. It is to see the divine not in symbols of authority, but in the silence between words, in the stillness that reveals truth. Their scrolls may remain locked in vaults, their names may be forgotten in textbooks, but their knowledge is alive. It moves through the dreams of seekers, through the lines of forbidden texts, through the resonance of those who refuse to forget. And when we choose to listen, truly listen, it returns, not as history, but as destiny. Thanks for listening. This has been Ancient Forbidden Knowledge. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.